I'd like to now introduce Ambassador O'Neill and welcome her to give her remarks, and thank you very much for opening this conversation for us. She asked me to keep her bio very short, so I will. She's a wonderful colleague and we're so delighted to have her. As many of you know, she's the former president of Inclusive Security for many years and also played a role in standing up the Dallaire Centre. And today she's the first Women, Peace and Security Ambassador for Canada, and we're delighted to have her.
Thanks, Anna. Hi, everybody. Hi to the rest of the Our Secure Future team, to Melinda and the whole team at the Dallaire Centre, everybody at the Athena Project, the WPS Curriculum Consortium Planning Committee, and the D&D Minds program folks for bringing us all together on this topic. Like the general just said, I really can't wait to hear the outcomes and loved reading through the detailed agenda. So I have to say it's really odd to be giving a keynote in front of so many of you from whom I have learned so much and whose writing and teaching and advocacy from inside systems and outside has shaped so much of my own thinking. And I have to share our kind organizers offered me much more time, and it made me think about a webinar I did a couple of weeks ago with a group in Edmonton, and my mother watched, and it was an hour long, and her feedback afterwards was that it was a good session, but there was a little too much of me in that hour. It was a discussion with me, and we had panels and interviews, but her takeaway was that it's just too much me. And that's my own mother, so I can only imagine what a few of you are thinking and feeling right now. So I'll speak for a little bit, and then we'll take questions. Comme Melinda dit en français ou en anglais, please submit in the language of your choice. And then we'll all be able to get on to moving to hearing the rest of you, my much smarter colleagues, retired Brigadier General José Lobidou and Annick Lucierez, and the great Corey Flazer and Colonel Rosie Stone. Hi to all of you. And then the others in the coming days. So very briefly on women, peace and security in Canada at the moment. You know, as many of you know, we're at the cusp of this big anniversary, 20 years of Security Council Resolution 1325. 20 years is also the anniversary of the last time that Canada was on the Security Council. And, you know, I'm very proud, obviously was not there at the time, but to say that we were early and proud supporters of 1325 with Bangladesh, Namibia, Jamaica, and some others. And you can see how it was formative and important in many ways. I think in part because it was also at a time when we were very committed to putting forward the concept of human security. And that was a key theme overall of our time on the council. And I think that the relationship of those really distinct concepts helped us to see women, peace, and security in many cases as key to achieving our broader goal. So as I see it, you know, ensuring women have an ability to influence their own lives in every aspect is both a rights issue and is an important part of an approach to increasing human security. So essentially, you know, it helps engage and create a much more human-centered rather than state-centered definition of security. But it was still clear that women, peace, and security needs targeted attention and a lot of visibility. And of course, in the years that have passed since, there's been also a lot of activism and movement building domestically, including by many of the people who are on this call or on this meeting today, many Canadian civil society members who got traction and got an increase in the discourse on women and gender, including in the federal government. So we saw changes like, it was actually 25 years ago that the government introduced gender-based analysis plus. And the government started in years since in making gender budgeting mandatory. They created the Department of Women and Gender Equality and the LGBTQ2 Secretariat and more. And of course, at that time, there was also a growing number of women in the Canadian Armed Forces, many rising in ranks, some serving in roles that were newly open to them and really shaping that discourse from within. And José is going to cover that in much more depth. And so we had our first national action plan in 2011, and then our second was launched in 2017. And so before I began this role a year ago, as you mentioned, I worked in civil society at the Institute for Inclusive Security. Hi, Mickey and Jolene and Don Steinberg, who never officially worked for us, but was basically unpaid staff whose labor we took advantage of. And alongside many of you, I really worked with you to try to increase the inclusion of women in leadership in all aspects of peace and security. And I have to say that the more I work on this, the more I'm convinced that our progress will always be severely hampered, especially our long-term progress, if we don't embed this work in the education that shapes professionals in relevant fields, including diplomats and military personnel. And so, as I said, you'll have discussants and speakers much wiser than I am during the course of this series, but I thought I'd kick us off with just a few reflections of the last 15 years trying to influence this issue from civil society, as an instructor, visiting instructor in a civilian university setting, and then now from inside government. So a few reflections. The first one being, the earlier in the careers that we reach people, the better. Obvious, but it bears repeating. So like many of you, I've had a experience of being in a workshop or a meeting and speaking with people who've achieved the highest pinnacles of their career, gone to the best schools, and et cetera, and are in very important positions. And they're almost being introduced for the first time, this concept that gender is a crucial dimension to understanding conflict, or that women experience conflict differently than men, and that they bring different perspectives. And it's very hard, I think, for people, number one, to both take that in substantively, but also to reconcile the fact that they've had some of the best education, some of the best training, and this has never come up in a sense. For many people that we've all worked with, especially in earlier times, have never heard it, and yet we're saying it's integral and core. So that's almost a barrier that you have to cross before you get into it. And when teaching, I stole this from our former chair, Swanee Hunt. I often show a video, and I would have done it today if I had more faith in my own technical capacity to do it. But some of you have seen the basketball video, we call it, which I think is a great learning tool on this subject. And so the idea of it is that, you show a video, it's about 60 seconds long, and you tell the students in advance, we want you to catch the number or count the number of times that these, I think, 4 basketball players pass the ball to each other. And so there's just 4 of them. They're not on a court. They're just, I don't even know where they're standing. And they're just, dribbling the ball and passing it back and forth to each other. So you show the video and ask them to tell me how many times they passed that ball. So some people are like 23, 24, and often students will get in some disagreement about how many it was. Like, no, there was that guy at the end, et cetera. And then you see some students with this kind of weird look on their face. And we end up saying, you say, how many of you noticed the gorilla? We're like, what? And so what happens, you show it again, and what happens, and this always was in the video, is that partway through, there's this man dressed in a gorilla suit, literally walks through the players, bumps his chest like a gorilla, and then keeps walking. And usually about half the students don't notice it. They're so focused on passing the ball back and forth and on counting it, that you're watching 4 people fairly up close, and you don't notice a man in a gorilla suit walking through, standing, and then carrying on. And people are, first of all, stunned that they didn't see it. You have to play it again, and they're shocked. But the idea is that you weren't told to look for it, so you weren't focused on it. It's so outside the realm of what you were expecting that your eyes just didn't even register it. It didn't kind of enter into your brain as something that you need to absorb. And then over the course of the remaining sessions, we often end up talking about what was the gorilla in this example. Were women mobilizing, organizing? Were women having different experiences? What were the dynamics that we missed, perhaps in this case study or this other experience, because we weren't looking for it? Either we weren't told to look for it, or we didn't even enter our minds that it was a possibility. So, first reflection, the earlier we get it kind of embedded in the brain that it's a possibility, even the better off. Second one is, we can't teach in an isolated box. So doing a session kind of at the end of a workshop on human rights or gender, that's an hour at the end of all the sessions, and then expect people when they go into their day jobs to mainstream gender. And that's something that we often call for. And so the idea of teaching and working on this, which I know is infinitely easier to say than to do, but really has to be integrated in the way that we do training if we expect it to be integrated into the way that people actually do their jobs. Third observation, as you all know, training on this really has to be customized or targeted or delivered at level, and including, involving customizing to the decision-making process of that person. And I think in women, peace, and security specifically, we often are really challenged to fold what we're talking about into the thought process of someone at varying levels of decision making. So, you know, a force commander might be most focused on force protection or on securing gains or just creating conditions for a political process to unfold. But often we're talking about the long-term benefits to inclusion, to a force or to a community, et cetera. So we're focused on the benefits 5-10 years down the road. And he or she as commander is thinking about it in a much shorter term. Not to say, of course, they can't hold both in their minds at the same time, but our training sometimes doesn't always address that. And one of the ways that with many of you kind of testing these over years that I found has been helpful has been to talk about the ways that our enemies or our adversaries are thinking about gender. So of course, you know, they don't call it by the same terms. They don't have the terminology challenges that we all have. They don't usually have a gender advisor. But, you know, you think about ISIS, 1 out of 5 fighters who left North America or Europe to fight with ISIS in Syria was a woman, 1 out of 5. So they were targeted specifically, obviously using campaigns designed by women, for other women, more person to person than online. It's very thoughtful and very well done. Same with Boko Haram, 2/3 of their suicide bombers are women, carefully chosen because they can move more freely within markets, attract less attention, et cetera. And I'll always remember an example that brought this to life for me with colleagues when we were working with women in Pakistan. Mickey and I had worked with women police officers and parliamentarians and civil society in Pakistan over many years. And one time I was there doing a workshop, and at the start of the workshop, all the news was dominated by the fact that a son of one of the Supreme Court judges in Pakistan was kidnapped. And so it was seizing the country, big issue. The kid was missing, where was he, et cetera. And it mobilized the police, the military, everybody was looking for him. And on about the 4th day of our workshop, there was breaking news on the TV. I think it was at breakfast in the morning in the hotel, and they had found the kid. They did a big press conference with the head of the army, and then, you know, lined up with this cadre of uniformed men behind him. We found him, et cetera. Bring to justice the perpetrators. And what the police women who were sitting around the breakfast table with us told us was that it was actually a female officer who was working at a checkpoint who found this kid. And the reason why, there are fewer than 1% of Pakistan's police officers and border control are women. So fewer than 1%. This woman who falls in that category happened to be working at a checkpoint while they were Taliban who had tried to, they drugged the kid, put him in a burqa, and tried to drive him in the backseat over the border into Pakistan. So because only women can search other women, she noticed this person, went to go search her, noticed the person was acting oddly, lifted the burqa and discovered this kid. Of course, nowhere in the narrative, the public narrative, was there the fact that it was a female police officer that was the reason this happened. But I share that story in part to emphasize that the kidnappers obviously banked on the fact that there would not be a female border officer who could do a search at that checkpoint. They knew the probability was exceptionally low, and they planned their operation around it. That's an aspect of gender dimensions in operations. Third point I'd say, I think I'm on my 3rd or 4th, that it's really problematic when learners have cognitive dissonance with what you're saying and what other messages they're receiving from their institutions. So in other words, it really matters to have internal and external coherence. And I really applaud General Vance, our Chief of Defense Staff, when he first introduced a major campaign to prevent sexual misconduct, prevent and address sexual misconduct in Canadian forces. One of the ways that he narrated it was that you can't expect a soldier who doesn't respect his peer, the person serving and fighting alongside him, to then turn around and have respect and engage constructively with a woman in a local community. The two don't go together. You know, and another component of this dissonance is that, you know, we tell people, and increasingly people are getting the message, that a focus on women, peace, and security is very important. It's core to our military's capacity. And yet we still have a ways to go in terms of professionalizing the space internally. So as Jose and other colleagues are doing tremendous work, and we need many, many more of them, and we need much more integration in planning and budgeting in creating positions and really treating it like a core capacity. I'm sure many of you probably on this call, especially in forces, started at some point as a focal point on gender or on women, peace, and security. And that was added to the rest of your important portfolio. And maybe they didn't know and actually took anything else out before they added it. And you may not have this as a full-time role, et cetera. So, it's important for people learning to see the institution structurally as taking this seriously, as I believe, we are doing, but it takes time, and reconcile that with the ideas that I'm getting about how important it is here in this course. So looking ahead just really briefly, and then we'll go to questions. I'll say 3 things that I think I'm looking forward to, and I have reason to believe I think are positive changes that we're facing. So one is that I think, especially in the Canadian Armed Forces, we're getting closer to the point where we don't need to waste time making a case that there are gender dynamics to everything. Often we do, but because of GBA Plus and because of attention to this, it's a little bit more normal, I understand now, and especially certainly outside of the forces, to expect to start with that, what are the gender dynamics, as opposed to, does this issue affect men, women, boys, girls, people, non-diverse or non-binary people in the same way? I think, some of our colleagues working on gender and cyber, for example, they've talked a lot about how, they're still spending a fair amount of time really trying to make the case, especially internationally and through the UN and elsewhere, that there are gender dynamics to cyber. So they had to commission research to identify really clearly what those are. So, they've identified things like when there's a breach of privacy, a cyber hacking, there's really gender dimensions of the protection of that info. So sexual minorities, for example, if information is leaked, can sometimes face prosecution or death. Medical records are hacked. Access to reproductive health services that women have accessed in the past can be weaponized. There's usually a lot more stigma associated with women's intimate photos being shared. There are gender dynamics to it. Even attacks on critical infrastructure can have gender dynamics. So, depending on the context or the region, women are sometimes more or less likely to trust state guidance to evacuate or to shelter in place, et cetera. There's all kinds of dynamics to this. And I think we're hopefully getting closer to a place where we won't have to spend so much time making the case that there are gender dynamics to everything, and we'll get a little bit closer to actually doing it. Second thing is that we have to continue to have so much more nuance and appreciation of intersectionality, and really not seeing women as a homogenous group. We have to recognize the full spectrum of intersectionality. So race, ethnicity, ability, age, as the general mentioned, sexual orientation, so much more. And including non-binary genders. And this is something that has been challenging to me to both teach and advocate around, and perhaps to many of you, because so much of our material, so much of our thinking is very binary. There are men, women, boys, and girls. And I've found it very challenging, especially when you're really trying to just get a foot in the door in someone's mind, to say, maybe women experience conflict differently than men, let alone girls. We're talking like just a small wedge. And then to talk about the idea of trans people or non-gender binary people, it's hard. I find it hard. And I was on a session a couple weeks ago on research within the Canadian Armed Forces. And of course, we don't have the 100% perfect data, but there are hundreds of members of the Canadian Armed Forces who identify as trans people. And so we are disregarding the experiences of hundreds of members. And those are the ones we know of. And that's, there's still so many more out there, but it's not just a abstract concept, and I really struggle with it. So I hope that we can talk about that in this group. And then the last thing I'll say before we go to questions is that I really hope that in future, we won't have instructors and teachers, professors and advocates having to face such a stark decision about how much to emphasize operational effectiveness. So I would love to see our conversation changing even more about this question. And as many of you know, we're still in a space where discussions often start by needing to make the case as to why we need women in a process, why we need women in forces, the value that they add. And that is really challenging and frustrating for many reasons, often because, one being that we don't start conversations about the most military personnel who are men asking men to articulate their specific, unique, and added value. And that it's rooted in the concept of many women having to prove that in addition to being able to do the job they're supposed to be able to do, which women constantly prove capable of doing, that they're bringing something else to the role. So that's on one side. On the other side, the reasons are compelling, and the diversity that we have when we have women, when we have minorities, when we have different ethnicities, et cetera, it really helps meet the essential needs of the mission. It actually does contribute to the effectiveness of any operation. But my hope is that the answer lies in actually changing our definition of operational effectiveness over time so that it is less narrowly defined. It is less defined on issues of force or might or so-called traditionally more male characteristics, but actually includes an expanded definition of leadership that includes emotional intelligence, that includes leaders who are not just burning out their staff and meeting a very narrow set of goals, but are actually reaching are focused on retention over the longer term. There are a whole range, and I'm sure we'll hear many more examples of this over this session, but we need to change, I think, our focus on what is the capability of the force that we need, and be responsive to the changing nature of conflict, to the different ways that people actually engage with security forces, to the fact that building civilian confidence in security forces and earning trust of communities is part of our operational capacity that we need to have, and then work backwards to generate a force that responds to that. And I think then we'll be able to talk about operational effectiveness in a way that doesn't feel quite so much like a trade-off. That's my wish list, my hope list, and I will stop there so we can either have a break or take questions depending on what Melinda and Sahana say. But thanks to all of you who I deal with often for listening through that. You can call up my mom and sympathize at some point, but wanted to say thanks for everybody and have a fantastic workshop.
Thanks, Ambassador O'Neill. So really appreciate your wonderful comments and so many detailed examples that you gave. It was very helpful. We do have one or two questions and I know that on our agenda, it says we're sort of into our break time, but I don't think people will mind if we take one question before we move to break, because we actually planned quite generous breaks. So I think that will be all right with everyone. So the question we have for you is, how much has your National Action Plan facilitated some of the teaching and training along the lines of what you presented? Or has that been mostly driven by the defense and the RCMP internally?
I don't see them as totally separate. Obviously, the RCMP and the Canadian Armed Forces and D&D are co-drafters of the National Action Plan. So, the National Action Plan, I'd say, and Jose can answer this, speak to this as well, but I think it has provided an umbrella so that people see the way that the work of different departments is adding up. And we actually have some focus on, the way that we look at violent extremism in public safety at Global Affairs and at D&D and the CAF, at least have a little bit more consistency. The other, and of course, this training has been progressing for years. I think the action plan has been instrumental in, for Jose and colleagues, having a timeline that is public, that is tabled in Parliament, that they have to report on every year, that civil society can follow up on and track. Beth's on the phone or on the call, Christine St. Pierre and others. I think it would be happening to some degree regardless. I'd say the National Action Plan has, at least from one perspective, enabled more transparency in the expected timeline and what's going on. Whether or not it's influenced the scale of it, I can't say.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Great. And then I think we'll take just one more question before we go to break, which is, if you could remove one barrier to training or implementing women, peace, and security in training and education, what would you choose to do? That might be actually very helpful for our whole consortium to think about over the next few days.
I wish that every instructor who teaches already had a curricula that integrated this. So I think some of we have fantastic instructors who can teach this in a standalone way and can incorporate it into components. That if I had a magic wand and could flip a switch, I would love for every instructor who teaches on every subject to have attention to this already built into their curriculum.
Yeah, that's great. I see a lot of heads nodding, so I think you have a lot of agreement.
Or there. People want me to stop talking when I go on break.
No, not at all.
One of the two.
It's been a pleasure to have you, and I believe you're going to try to stay with us for a little bit. Yeah.
Yes, and join parts of the rest of the week for sure.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Thanks so much.